For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. One of 2 ball courts at this site. As I recall, we've seen a ball court in every ancient Mayan city we've visited, sometimes more than one, as here. From what I understand, some 1,500 of them have been discovered in Mesoamerica. I've been promising to tell you something about the ball game, so I'm going to fulfill that promise right now. Notice that the court, or playing alley, is shaped like a capital letter I. They're made of limestone and once had a polished limestone plaster on them to make them smooth. There's some variation, but the most common length of a court is about 65 feet long. The game was played widely, from the American Southwest all the way to Colombia and in the Caribbean. It was also played for many centuries and is still even by some Mesoamerican cultures today, with quite a bit of variation, so it's challenging for historians to determine exactly what the rules of the game were in the classic period. Actually, maybe it's better to think of this as a family of related games rather than a single game. In classical Mayan, the game was known as pits. In the Aztec language of Nahuatl, it was called olamalistli, or tlachtli. I hope I didn't butcher those. Sometimes you will hear it called poktapok, but that's just a term invented for it by a Danish archaeologist who adapted it from the Yucatec Mayan word pokopol. No one knows the exact rules of pits, but Spaniards in the 1500s, who saw the Aztec version of the game, reported that the sport had 2 teams of between 2 and 4 players each. It varied. They had to keep the ball in constant motion without letting it touch the ground. But they weren't allowed to use their hands or feet, so most often they would use their hips, thighs, and upper arms. But what were the sloped terraces for? Well, players could keep the ball in play by bouncing it off the slopes. In fact, it was easier to keep it from going out of bounds by using the slope. Different courts have different angles on these slopes, and it was harder to play the steeper slopes because the ball bounces off of them faster. Games were won by tallying points, and the primary way of getting them was by driving the ball into the opposing team's end zone, the top and bottom of the I shape of the court. If a player let the ball bounce more than twice before returning it to the other team, or let the ball go out of bounds, or touched a teammate, points were given to the opposite team. The ball they used in the game was rubber, made from the latex sap of the Castilla elastica tree, and the sap of a vine of the morning glory species. Although depictions of the ball in Mayan painting and reliefs are quite large, interpreters are of the opinion that the depictions are exaggerated. In much the same way as the headdresses, the ball was probably slightly bigger than a baseball, and knowing the composition of the rubber, it's estimated to have weighed about 3 to 6 pounds. The game was brutal, and the ball could inflict serious injuries on a person. One Spanish chronicler reported that players had been killed when the ball hit them in the head or the gut. None of the player uniforms have survived, so we have to go by what we see in the art. The basic outfit consisted of a loincloth, sometimes augmented with leather hip guards. In some areas, a thick girdle, probably made of wicker or wood covered in fabric or leather, was worn. Sometimes you might also see images of knee pads or garters worn below the knee, or chest protectors, gloves, or helmets. The headdresses you see were probably only worn in ritual context and not during the game. This ball game is the oldest known game in organized sports, going back some 3,500 years. We're not entirely sure, but we surmise it originated in the Olmec heartland, home of the rubber tree, along the Gulf Coast. The oldest ball court, found at Paso de la Amada in Guatemala, is dated to 1400 BCE. The oldest balls found are from around 1600 BCE. Now you're probably thinking, when is he going to talk about the stone rings? Ah yes, the stone rings. Interestingly, they only started being added to the courts, as far as we can tell, about 1200 CE in the post-classic period. It's a later innovation. A 16th century chronicler says that in the game of that time, if a player got the ball through the ring, it was an automatic win for their team. As you might guess, it was a rare event, and games most often were still won on points. The game was super popular and played for all kinds of reasons. It could be a game between friends, an organized event with plenty of gambling on the teams, or as a ritual spectacle organized by the rulers. These ceremonial games carried religious significance and were believed to have had spiritual effects. Sometimes disputes between two cities were resolved through a game. A game might even be played in the place of an actual war. At other times, in rigged ritual games, a city's rulers would actually play the game against a group of warriors that they captured in a battle, and of course, the city rulers would win, and the captives would then be sacrificed. Despite what you may have heard, human sacrifice after a game was not all that common.